Today we're going to talk about a very interesting case study, and that is how do you supply water to California, particularly the Central Valley and Southern California, in a state, an area that is subject to regular and systematic droughts. The goal today is to understand the appropriate role of science in policy and management, particularly from the perspective of a policy analyst. How do you use and or avoid misusing science in analyzing public policy options? The case study sets place in California, and it deals with the issue of California droughts, which are an old problem in California, one they've dealt with for as long as the state has been a state and even well before. If we look at the policy context, it's important to look at the historical record. And this record is really, there's two broad ways you could look at it. One is to reconstruct the past and the problem you're trying to avoid by using the living memory. That is, the memory of people who are alive, their parents or grandparents, great-grandparents, the written record. And in California, that goes back to about 1850, where there's quite good records about weather conditions, floods, droughts, and so on. Or you can look at what we might call the historical record, perhaps 1,000 or 2,000 years, because after all, droughts, floods, these kinds of things have occurred fairly frequently over the long-term record. And if the policy is to avoid those kinds of problems, it would be a much more expensive fix than just trying to avoid the problems that have occurred in the past 150 years as an example. Well, let's look for a bit at the difference between looking at this policy issue from a living memory standpoint versus a historical record standpoint. If you go back 1,200 years in California, look at the precipitation, which includes both rainfall and snowfall for the last 1,200 years. And you can do this by historical reconstruction using tree cores, sediment cores, and so forth, and get a fairly accurate estimate of the conditions, temperatures, as well as amount of precipitation. Well, if you look at the 1,200-year record, the dashed line across the center of this photograph or this artwork is the average, the long-term average. But if you look at the long-term average, 1,200 years, it's pretty obvious that no single year is very typical. There is an average condition, but rarely are we ever at average. The areas above the line are the drier conditions, that is the warmer temperatures, and the areas below the line, the blue areas, are the wetter or cooler temperatures. And you can see there possibly appears to be a long-term pattern, but in average, there's a lot of variability in the data. And certainly, if you're looking at temperature conditions, it could either be very warm or very cold in a particular year, but that doesn't really tell you a lot about the long-term average. So in short, what assumptions would a policy maker, a person who makes these decisions about flood control and flood water storage, what would they assume they're managing for, the problem they're trying to avoid? And more specifically, you also have to factor in what you expect the long-term climate to be. If you go back 1,000 years, say around 800, 900, we get the beginning of the medieval warm period, which is a relatively 400 or 500 year period of fairly warm temperatures, similar to what you have in the last 150 years. And then that was followed in about 1400, 1350, 1400, with a cooling off so-called Little Ice Age. And it was about 300 or 400 years of fairly cool conditions, relatively speaking, a fairly wet climate for California. And then the modern warming period, starting roughly 150 years ago, you have a generally warming condition, and things are very different than they were in the Little Ice Age. And of course, in the very far area, you have that big rise, that red sliver, and arguably that's a significant part of that is due to human actions. I mean, there's some debate, obviously, about how much of that warming is due to natural cycles versus human-caused cycles, but nonetheless, from a policy standpoint, if you're looking at water supply, it is what it is. You have to deal with it regardless of what's causing the warming. Also, large droughts have been common in California. If you go back to the medieval warm period, say around 900 to 1300, you look at these big mega droughts on the big orange or big brownish orange blocks there. These droughts lasted a century or perhaps more. They were the ones that wiped out the local population in the area. These were droughts like we haven't seen for 1,000 years. Moving into the 1400s and 1500s, we had a series of these smaller droughts called decadal droughts. These lasted for 10, 20 years, a few decades. They were big droughts. By modern standards, they're much bigger than modern ones, but they were not like the mega droughts. And then if you move up to current times, for the last 150 years, we've had big droughts like in the 30s and the early parts of this century. They certainly haven't been of the scale of the decadal droughts, but they're definitely significant. And of course, for a policy maker, the issue here is the political call is, what level of problem are we trying to solve here? And are we going to focus only on the current level of droughts, or perhaps we could have these more decadal droughts developing later in this century? In addition to that, a policymaker has to look at issues like, what about these unpredictable but major events that occur? For example, the most recent one is 1861-62 over Christmas. There was a so-called Pineapple Express rain event for multiple weeks, literally flooded the Central Valley of California to a depth of several feet, flooded the capital, the state capital, Sacramento. And in fact, the state capital was moved to San Francisco because it couldn't operate in Sacramento. It also, this flood bankrupted the state. About a third of the property in California was declared of no value, and as a result, no taxes. So the state went bankrupt. And this is the great flood that bankrupted the state of California. Now, if you want to plan a reservoir system, a water system to account and handle this type of a rain event, that would be incredibly expensive. It's not to say you shouldn't do it, but if you were going to design a system to accommodate this, it would be much, much more involved than just the routine floods and rainfall events. Okay, regardless of what the policy makers and the public want to solve in terms of the level of risk they're willing to tolerate, California has recognized for a long time that they have a serious water problem, and several years ago, the voters passed Proposition 1. One of the elements in Proposition was to fund feasibility studies of creating more storage reservoirs in the mountains around the Central Valley particularly, to store water such that it would be available in August when water tends to run very low. So the idea behind this was very simple. Identify sites around the state where impoundments could be built, dams, that would store water such that it would be available in late summer. So the idea is pretty simple. Now, one element of this was part of the effort was to assess the likely ecological effects of each of these dams, proposed dams. And let's do a little role playing here. Imagine that you have become and have been agreed to serve as a member of an elite scientific evaluation team. And your team, composed of world's experts in fisheries, wildlife, forestry, hydrology, water, and so on, your job is to determine the likely ecological effects of putting a dam on rivers, such as A here, to create reservoirs that could store water through summer, B. Now, the governor, legislatures, and others have said, look, go out and assess the consequences. We know there's going to be large ecological consequences, and tell us what they are. Now, we all know, and certainly you know, that science deals with is issues. The state of the world is this, not ought issues or should issues. In other words, science philosophically does not tell you the way the world ought to be, it just tells you the way the world is. And we all know that going back to middle school science, scientific method, which is supposed to be policy neutral. And that leads us to the issue of normative science. Normative science is simply science, traditional science, that has a built-in and usually hidden policy preference, assumed policy preference. And we all know in traditional science that's a no-no, but it happens. And it happens, I would say, reasonably frequently. It is not that easy to detect. It would seem like it would be simple to do, but oftentimes it's not. One of the reasons it's not is because typically normative science is presented in a way that makes it look like regular science. It certainly sounds like regular science, and it's presented by people who call themselves scientists. In fact, oftentimes they are scientists. They've just stepped out of the policy neutrality of science and into the policy advocacy role, but they've hidden their advocacy in scientific terms that sound like policy neutral science. Regardless, normative science is a corruption science. Now, back to your team's report. This has been a fabulous exercise. The team is really great. They produced a tremendous report, and now it's time to present the results to the governor, to the legislature, to the public. So here is your chance to present information that's policy relevant and would be important in making a decision of whether the money ought to be spent to build this reservoir. How would you describe the results? After all, you are various types of scientists, and how would you present this information to the public or the governor? If you use terms like ecosystem degradation, I would argue you have slipped into normative science. Why? Because to use the term degradation implies that you made the assumption that a free-flowing river, the one on the left, is somehow preferable to a dammed river, the one on the right. It's clearly different ecological effects, the systems function differently, and so forth. But it's not better or worse until you apply a policy judgment, which is outside the purview of science or policy analysis for that matter. Or you could take the exact same science, no difference in the science, and describe this as ecosystem improvement. After all, the reservoir on the right will have water available in August, and if that's important to you, that's a good thing. But that's not better or worse until you apply a policy judgment. If your goal is to provide August water, then policy-wise, you may prefer the system on the right, build a dam. Otherwise, you may prefer the system on the left if your priority is, for example, salmon runs. Neither of those are right or wrong scientifically, but they are very different. I would argue that you ought to use terms like ecosystem alteration. Alteration is very clear in this meaning that the systems will be different, they will be altered, they'll function differently, but they are not better or worse. They are not degraded or improved until you apply a value judgment, a policy judgment. And that comes not from scientists, not from policy analysts, but from the governor, from the legislature, or the public, or any of the advocacy groups out there. So, key point, the science didn't change any of the three examples, whether we use degradation, improvement, or alteration, exactly the same science. I would argue the first two, degradation and improvement, were examples of normative science, whereas alteration is policy neutral. Lessons learned. First lesson, advocates, policy advocates, both individuals and groups, will typically hide their advocacy in what appears to be policy neutral science. It looks like science, it sounds like science, usually it's brought to by people with degrees in science, but in fact, it's just a type of advocacy. It is essentially advocacy masquerading as science. Or, two, second lesson, whether it's intentional or not, using normative science, that is science with an embedded policy preference, is stealth policy advocacy. It's stealth policy advocacy because many listeners, many readers, many people who consume this science will not even realize that it's subtly, stealthily pushing the reader or listener towards a particular policy preference. Hence the commonly used term stealth policy advocacy. Third, avoiding normative science does not mean that a scientist should not play a role in policy deliberations. Policy neutral and high quality science needs to come from scientists, but it does not need to come from scientists wrapped in a policy preference. Scientists ought to stick to the role of the science, the is statements, this is the way it is, this is the way it will be under current policy. If you change the policy this way, here's the likely effect. Those are neutral. They don't tell society or the governor what they ought to do. Finally, your job as a policy analyst, when you listen to scientific information, when you hear it, when you read it, you need to watch out for embedded policy preferences. A lot of people can very effectively hide policy advocacy in their science, and it takes a very attuned listener to pick up on it. Good luck. This is a challenging activity, but one that becomes very enjoyable with experience.